Hello, I'm Hardeep Matharu. I'm the editor-in-chief of Byline Times, and I am joined today by Peter Jukes, its co-founder and executive editor. Today, Donald Trump returns to the White House, and Peter and I are going to be talking about how we made it to this moment. Peter, in Joe Biden's farewell address to the nation, he warned the country that oligarchy had come to America. If you had to pinpoint one factor, there are many, but one factor that you think led us to this point, what do you think it is?
I think the other thing he spoke about was the torrent of lies. The sense of truth has left media, social media. And I think, Hardeep, to our, 6 years almost of doing the paper, one of our key themes beyond oligarchy has been declining trust in the media. This revolution now, we realize we're 15 years into a 100-year revolution of social media, the internet, decline of mainstream media. And I think the inauguration, who's attending it, is really important. Obviously, we have all these right-wing figures from Europe. Aaron Banks didn't get in because of his visa, the funder of Leave EU, but a lot of people like Suella Braverman. Obviously,
Liz Truss, Lawrence Fox.
Exactly, all the worst people in the world. No, I'm kidding. But obviously, it's a deeply conservative, reactionary, right-wing moment. But if we're looking something beyond that, if we're looking at historical analogies, it is a revolution in the media. And where did Donald Trump really, he came to be, he's not really a property mogul. He's an intellectual property mogul. He comes to prominence and sort of pathway to power. Various routes. One is reality TV as The Apprentice, as a media figure. Now, we can hold for aside Putin, information operations. So you have, I think, you say Ronald Reagan was a media figure, he was an actor. But the first ever, in 2016, sort of personality is completely media confected, polytainment. But what's the main new power? Who are the big people there? Who are the richest people in the world attending?
Exactly. Well, it's really interesting, this notion of oligarchy, because you have this notion of a business elite, which I think people traditionally see it as, and there's some argument that Donald Trump is part of that, but not of that. But of course, the tech media barons are the oligarchy. So to be specific, when Biden says oligarchy has come to the United States, he's talking about the tech media barons who have fused with the Donald Trump MAGA movement and are now coming to power. I mean, Elon Musk is the biggest tech media baron in the world's richest man, and now a member of the US government. It strikes me that Biden used that terminology, finally, because that has never been seen before, that fusion of the state and tech power and business elites.
So this is something, as we know, our colleague, our joint friend, Carol Cadwallader, has been talking about since 2017-18 in her revelations about Cambridge Analytica.
Few foresaw it. That's what you wrote in the latest edition of Byline Times. Few foresaw the fusion between tech oligarchy and populism.
And politics. And so she was much derided, I think deliberately buried, and obviously we could talk about the legal case that silenced her for 2 years. So the classic thing, oligarchy, he uses this term, and he quotes, doesn't he? He cites Dwight Eisenhower, president for 2 terms, famous farewell address when he warned of the dangers of the military-industrial complex. Here, we could say somewhat late, he warns of this tech-industrial complex. The difference is, if you look at what happened with Rand and all those big military companies in the 50s and 60s, they didn't control the media. Neither, going back to another moment of oligarchy, which is the end of the 19th century, railroad barons and oil barons. This is when Theodore Roosevelt started trust busting against Standard Oil. Because capitalism, for right and wrong, and I quite like open markets, but it does tend to a capital accumulation, monopoly. And the end of the 19th century, railroads and oil, they'd own everything. And so what you had is this movement of trust busting. People like Hearst, the famous press barons would own mines, and like Citizen Kane made his money in a gold mine, the fictional Citizen Kane. But they may own newspapers, but they wouldn't own the air we breathe. And this is the extraordinary power these tech barons have, the Broligarchy, as Carol coined that term, which has gone viral. The weird thing about them is, isn't it, Hardeep? We don't pay them directly, right?
No.
I've never paid, well, some people do, sign up the blue tick, they pay Elon Musk. I haven't paid Zuckerberg, I haven't by Bezos, I suppose I do pay before when I had a subscription to the Washington Post. But generally, this whole thing with these free products, which we sign up to and give our data over, and that's the most valuable thing, our data. On Facebook, that's worth $500 a year for their targeting of advertising. And so through Google is also there, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, TikTok, X, we sign over our data, which then they monetize into advertising and political advertising. This is crucial. Killing the very media you came from. The local journalism you were schooled on was killed by the internet.
And in that sense, the tech oligarchy has crept up on us. Some people said, why didn't Joe Biden not say this earlier? And obviously Carol Cadwalader did all of her reporting. But in a sense, you're right, because the larger context is, as Carol says, this tech revolution that we're living through, an age of massive transformation. And at the beginning, when Facebook first came out, I remember I was at university and it was just something you did to make friends with people that you met at nightclubs and saw in lectures. There was no notion that when you were signing up to those platforms then, or even Twitter when I became a journalist, that there would be some sense of I'd be participating in a tech revolution in which I am the product. And in that way, it's crept up. I also think that people like Carol, who tried to warn and foresaw at the time, we're talking about nearly 10 years ago, that no, this isn't just disruption and populism through Brexit and Trump. This is part of a wider shift, and tech is going to become really important in terms of politics. What I think was really interesting, and we've talked before about this, Peter, is at that moment, if governments, if other members of the established press in both in the UK and America had taken the whole issue incredibly seriously, I think perhaps we would be at a different moment right now. Part of the big win of the big tech oligarchs and why they're come to ultimate power in the government now is because they successfully managed to shut down as conspiracy what seemed unbelievable, even though it was true, i.e. how Carol revealed that tech was being used and weaponized in politics. But it's really interesting that now it's just all around us, and it's very hard to say, what can we do about it?
So it's really important that, and it's only retrospectively I understand this. Because like you, I'd sign a Facebook, only connect the world, only cause genocide in Myanmar, only put forward this information. X, the scale of it's quite staggering, Hardeep, because I did a calculation. We start today, this is Monday, 20th of Jan, a trial finally of the Murdoch empire of News of the World, The Sun, and their unlawful information gathering and concealment and destruction. Now, we look back on the power, and that's why I came to a journalist Rupert Murdoch had. He was known as the 24th member of the cabinet. Even Blair, every Prime Minister, Theresa May, David Cameron, invite him in when they court his approval for elections. His empire is worth $15 billion, right? Elon Musk made $100 billion overnight during the election. That means he could buy out Murdoch 6 times. And the thing was with Murdoch, he wasn't a member of government. So I do think that what we missed was...
And not particularly charismatic, or not sort of a meme villain that you could put all over social media, like the star of Succession, but not really...
But quite quiet, reserved.
Quite quiet and like to be in the shadows. That was the whole point.
They all like to be in the shadows. Rebecca Brooks hated the publicity she got as her CEO here. But that model, the regulator gaming the ref, basically what Murdoch did was... made a lot of money selling papers, but pressure parliaments, politicians, favourable legislation, hold them hostage. But he's basically used the spectre of his readers to threaten politicians. If the Sun goes after you on this campaign, John Major, you'll have difficulties. And you could say he swayed elections, absolutely, at that margin. What he didn't, he wasn't in the readers' data in their minds. He can only surmise what. Now, oddly enough, on the Sun, most readers vote Labour. What you have here, and I do think the Matrix analogy is very, very useful. I go back to that meeting in 2013, the Young Britons Foundation, funded by the same people who funded Cambridge Analytica, Robert Mercer, and the Young Americas Foundation. Steve Bannon turns up with Harry Cole of The Sun, Guido Fawkes at that point. They're all talking about digital campaigning. And what digital campaigning lets you do in Facebook when it was open-ended, when Carroll discovered, I had some help with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, they were taking all our data. So that famous line, I think, I'll repeat it again because people don't get this. After 10 likes, Facebook knows you better than your friends know you. After 50 likes, it knows you better than your partner knows you. After 100 likes, it knows you better than you know yourself. The famous ad, which was, there's a legal case, I forget what happened to it. The advertising algorithm knew this 16-year-old girl was pregnant before she did. The pattern of behavior. So that amazing to have the world in silico. You can play, as Cambridge Analytica did, 75 million user profiles. And so we've given up our data to them, in which en masse with the machine learning is incredibly revelatory about us. And I look at that like The Matrix, that movie with Keanu Reeves. The first one's good, the other's terrible. They're these robots that are sucking our heat out of us, and we live in these cocoons, and they're basically using our energy. Well, I'd say they use our data in the modern Matrix, and they then relay back to us. This is the crucial difference between any other technology or media moment I can think of. Not only they're sucking the data out of you, they're replaying it back to you in tailored forms to trigger you, as you write brilliantly about Hardeep, the way these emotions are triggered. And Cambridge Analytica did that in that limited way. I was one of the hack profiles, only 75 million. Elon Musk has done this with 600 million people during the course of the election. He's basically taken their data, they have open data access, got AI modeled it, and then game the algorithm, game the messages, check the most effective messages in account to en masse create an alternative reality.
I think this idea of how the notion of influence has changed from the traditional media and Murdoch through to Elon Musk and social media and the tech revolution is pretty key. So Cambridge Analytica, for anybody who maybe doesn't know, is the now defunct data profiling company that came to prominence after the 2016 EU referendum and, of course, the election of Trump. And Carol Cadwalder revealed in The Observer that millions and millions of Facebook accounts, the data was essentially taken and used by this company and its affiliates, yes, in order to gain psychometric understanding and profiling of them, which was used in the 2016 US presidential election, and a parliamentary committee in the UK has found that it's likely that that was also part of what happened with the Brexit vote. So this notion that we've gone from a media baron who comes in around the back of Downing Street, who doesn't want to be a character or a profile in his own right, and he can give this notional sense that I can influence the public because they read my newspapers, is very different from Elon Musk controlling the algorithm of the platform formerly known as Twitter, which was a big journalistic platform. A lot of people got their news that way. I'm going to control what people are seeing in their news feeds. And these news feeds, I think it's really important to say, it's not necessarily this image that people are going into the study in their house and sitting at a table and logging on. Yes. We're all carrying all of these messages and this messaging around with us all the time. We can be on the train, we can be on holiday, we can be anywhere. I think it's interesting what you say, Peter, about the influence is about getting inside your head. And that's where the emotionality comes in. Humans are many things. It's not just we're completely emotional. We can also be very rational. We can also be very curious and understanding, as well as lack compassion and empathy. But it's really interesting which trigger points are activated. And to my mind, it's emotionality and heightened emotionality, heightened versions of it through fear and insecurity and anger is what platforms such as X are really, really good at. That's the difference. In a way, Rupert Murdoch couldn't sit at your dinner table and rile you up and rile you up and rile you up. But actually, Elon Musk can via a smartphone.
So this is really important, Hardeep, because the fact that Zuckerberg and part of his kowtowing to Trump when it was clear he was going to win.
So Meta is going to contribute to the inaugural fund.
$1 million, I think it's already had that. And also, it has removed its fact-checking.
Yes, that's
so there are
fact-checking.
It's difficult and always contentious. And we talk about this, maybe the theme of our festival. The abandonment of truth is also the abandonment of collectivity and society. Because back in the past, we talked to Jay Rosen about journalism, about the post-war standard. There was, whatever the political differences between Republicans and Democrats, or some in the UK, between Conservatives and Labour, an underlying agreement what the facts were, the common basis, if you like the rule of law sometimes, but a scientific understanding. These are the facts of the economy. We think it's better this way. If you have a world where there are no agreed facts, if everything, chemtrails, Jan 6, everything, the moon landings, COVID vaccines, everything is up for subjective grab, then it's very, very difficult to build any sense of connection beyond those people who just agree with your reality. I think one of the slogans from Facebook back in the early days, we all joined it in that tech utopian idea, we are the world, like a big Coca-Cola ad, was connect. Just connecting friends across the world. It's disconnecting us all from a common reality. This is in terms of addressing any common problem like climate change or an insurrection or a pandemic. How can societies preserve themselves or a threat from another military force like Russia or China if that basic common understanding of reality is gone? Obama warned about this about 10 years ago, and I think that's what Biden was talking about. We go into a post-Enlightenment world.
Yeah, these truths we hold to be self-evident, but I guess the notion of truth now
self-evident truth
is agreed facts. Truths are things that we all carry within us. It's your truth, it's my truth. It's really interesting, even for us, we can lament that the truth has been lost.
Yeah.
I guess what we've lost is, as you say, shared realities based on facts, or the notion that that could be something that exists in a widespread way. But truth now has become, and I think connected with identity as well, a very personalized notion, not even philosophical. There always has been a notion of truth. Go back to Plato and Socrates and a kind of philosophical sense of truth. And how can we ever know the truth? But what we see these days is not really a philosophical sense of truth. It's a personalized, emotional sense of truth, which seems to be different. My story, different from even facts, because people have their truth about climate change.
So I think it's really interesting, Hardeep.
For example.
And this sort of post-truth world, it began sort of philosophically with postmodernism and the New Left. And it started on the left, really, and understandably so, because you had this post-war idea, 200 years of enlightenment, rule of law, but it was all white men and the American Constitution, founding fathers held slaves. So that was chipped away. What about people of color? What about women? What about other identities? In a way which people call identities politics, because obviously and I see the problem with that is my story, my interpretation of this is this. It's really important to validate those unheard stories. It's crushed by pale male stale men like myself. It was always this version of reality. But to undermine the whole, that every reality is subjective. I mean, it's just not true. I mean, we wouldn't be able to run this mic, wouldn't be able to broadcast, wouldn't be able to get in the morning. There has some accepted truths about protocols and internet, train timetables, medicine, lighting. But we live in such a luxurious world with these incredibly smart phones that ping us every moment and send us messages. We forget the underlying science of it all. So this sense of completely, so I feel this is true. There is an antidote to it, but it's very, very slow.
I guess also people might argue, so for example, take Brexit. Some people might argue that where have facts got us? What I mean by that is why do people go towards these more emotionally charged truths as opposed to facts? It must be because our societies, as they have evolved in modern politics in the decades that have gone by, facts didn't really get us anywhere because facts led to heightened levels of inequality. Facts made us more insecure. Facts meant that the financial crisis, all the people that caused that were bailed out, and the people who actually suffered had to pay the price for ordinary people. What happened in the realm of factuality, if you like, or a shared notion of reality that was so dissatisfying and disappointing to people that people, as Michael Gove famously said, everyone's had enough of experts. Let's leave the facts and let's go on this kind of emotionally charged vision of let's leave the EU and let's have Donald Trump. It's so interesting to see how we went from facts let us down.
There's no doubt that world of experts let us down. And I think what we've come to the realization, Hardeep, isn't it, over the last 5 or 6 years, in a way with Brexit and Trump and Russia, trying to rescue this notion of the rule of law, old style democracies, we call it pluralism, but some people might call it liberal democracy, that has not withstood this test. And I think the reasons you adduce...
Big part of the story, isn't it?
It's the whole part of the story, is that the reasons you adduce for why people have had enough for experts. Flatline wages, a bailout of the banks. These institutions we trusted came up with these ridiculous formulas for credit default swaps, and, it's going to be completely safe, says Greenspan, the head of the Federal Reserve. The Bank of England, light touch regulation. All crashes, falls apart, the cash points almost fail. Boats are stocking up outside Amsterdam because the whole world, there's no liquidity. The credit crunch was almost a terminal event for the economies. Somebody like Gordon Brown sorts out this great bailout. Nobody's put to prison. The state pays for the rich. Socialism for the rich. Meanwhile, as we've all seen, massive growing inequality, not in all societies, but particularly in the US, particularly the UK. So America's richer than it was 8 years ago, but people aren't. Billionaires are making more money. Some people can't afford the price of eggs. I think you're right. A bit like Brexit, that sense of austerity, everything's wrong. Cameron screwed it up, Blair, Iraq, I hate them all. Let's press the red Brexit button. Because they played it brilliantly. Elites, they've let us down. Hit this red button.
But the people in these liberal democracies, running them, the politicians, arguably, as you say, haven't come up with a solution or an antidote to this sort of populist wave that is more emotionally driven, I would argue. Also, what they're grappling with is a tech revolution, it's a transformation. Is it that people who are perhaps dissatisfied, are they dissatisfied with the particulars of liberal democracy or the principles or both?
I see this is exactly the point, right? So the outcomes of neoliberalism, if you like, of the American Anglo-Saxon model of deregulation, privatization, laxer taxation rules, has been, and it's always the problem with open market economies, free market economies, increasing agglomeration of wealth to those who already have it. Those who have assets, they make 6% every year, wages are flatline. So you end up with growing inequality. Now, this has happened at crucial moments in the Roman Empire, before the French Revolution, before the Russian Revolution. And capital and labor get out of kilter. Capital owns everything. People are struggling. Now, the revolution doesn't always have to be a left-wing revolution. In the 30s, as we saw across Europe, it was a fascist revolution generally. So this sense of the people are not having power and their dissatisfaction with status quo, I also get why, though they attempted to, and some good politicians attempted to, liberal democracies have failed to address it. And it's not just Anglo-Saxon countries, America and the UK, kind of leading both on the tech edge and the populist edge. But it's hit Italy, it's hit the Netherlands. It's this sense of stultification. The existing order isn't working. And I now, having hoped for it, agree with you and Anthony Barnett, particularly it isn't, right? What's replacing it at the moment is that dissatisfaction is being channeled to a competing elite. So in these times, Peter Turkin writes about it brilliantly, these revolutionary moments after capital inevitably is called the wealth pump, starts pumping up to the rich until you get a crisis. It's the Black Death or World War II, and then catastrophe happens. People lose a lot of money. There's a shortage of labor, so wages go up. What he says, the two factors that lead to revolutionary crises, immiseration of the population, and that can be a general immiseration, I mean relative immiseration. We're not as poor as the 1930s. We have our flat screen TVs. We can't afford a house in London, or the rentals are still high. But the most important thing is when you get this growing inequality, you get what he calls the overproduction of elites. They're teachers, they're lawyers, Lenin, Robespierre, the guy who led the Boxer Rebellion. All these people are educated to be leaders, and there's too many elites, so they begin to fight each other. And what you see with Aaron Banks challenging the blob, or Liz Truss here challenging the elites, the woke capitalism, right? Or slightly different in America, the Broligarchs taking over from the oil companies, is elites fighting each other. Our only hope for this, I think, is those elites aren't all of the same mind. I mean, you've seen this already with Steve Bannon.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, because what's really interesting about what's happening in America is we've been talking about neoliberal democracy and capitalism and how that has failed a lot of people who are justifiably angry about it and think that Trump can maybe fix that, along with immigration, which they see as connected as a failure of neoliberal democracies and the market and labor moving so freely across the world. So there's almost the Steve Bannon, traditional grassroots, very nativism. But that's quite different from the tech bros. For them, democracy gets in the way. It stops them innovating. It stops them making profits. It stops them coming up with how we're going to live in Mars eventually. And they don't necessarily critique the neoliberal order. They've done very well out of it, and a very extreme notion of neoliberalism, which America has been heading towards for many years. So these two factions are quite different in themselves. But it is, again, just really interesting that people are so dissatisfied with the current system that they perhaps see Donald Trump and Elon Musk, and they don't see them as people who are vastly wealthier than they are and maybe have their own interests. They see them as channels who could make things better for the country and bring prosperity. And it's really interesting to consider why that is, considering they are a part of an elite, and especially Musk.
But you see, there are different elites. I think people voted for Trump in the beginning. He's going to shake things up. He's not part of the Washington elite. He's a businessman. So, especially in America, there's so many competing elites. There's regional bases, the LA elite, the Texas elite, the New England elite. There is this sense of always, and they used to rotate the presidency, these different elites. And this is a more insurrectionary one.
It's also a frontier mentality. The tech revolution is from Silicon Valley, and the frontier mentality is, well, the frontiers are now Mars and the universe, and we've transformed everyone's lives because you carry computers around in your pockets. So, I guess what I'm saying is arguably one of America's biggest achievements as this very innovative state that gives people a lot of freedom has been the tech bros.
So the funny thing is that people who said America can only survive with a frontier. It had a spatial frontier for 400 years, and then had a space frontier, and then you could say a cyberspace frontier. And then Elon Musk and the Mars ridiculous thing, he's never going to go to Mars. If you did, he'll die. Maybe you should. Is that is part of exactly the way they overcame the sense of inequality. And actually, those were equal moments, not for Native Americans, very unequal moments, but in terms of the demographics of America was the move west, that poor people could find land. There was a sense of mobility, which you didn't get in sclerotic European societies. Then once you get closure of that, they start fighting. Once you end up not having the barbarian at the gates.
But maybe some people find Musk appealing for that reason, because actually there is a narrative that he's a genius, that he's innovative, that he pushes boundaries, that he's achieved a lot of things in terms of his businesses and tech. If you're so dissatisfied with this notion of liberal democracy, someone like Musk, they want disruption and chaos. Why not?
And also he's seen as an innovator. I know members of my family who admire elements of him. I doubt he is really an innovator. He's an exploiter of innovations. And I think it's very important when we use the word capitalism, which we had better terms for it, or in entrepreneurship. So I think the people who founded Tesla, not Musk, SpaceX, not Musk, were entrepreneurs, right? We all need that. There is, especially when it comes to Peter Thiel, another South African, or David Sachs, another South African, who's mates with it. There are the investors, the venture capitalists. Musk isn't a venture capitalist. They spot a winner and they get cheap loans and then they dominate. So there's that very different, he projects himself as this amazing experimenter. He's basically a venture capitalist. And I think that form of capitalism is very different from the innovative sort of entrepreneurship we celebrate. But that, you're right, the key thing about Musk, he's a South African, he wants to go to Mars, his mates, and he wants these visas for other members of cabinet, Indian background, big Indian diaspora in America, especially in tech. Meanwhile, Steve Bannon, their motto of the world is, I don't agree with this, but the theory is, and the experience sometimes for more established migrants into America, is that new people are coming along. The ridiculous thing about them eating cats and dogs is just a meme, a kind of defamation put on top of them. But the feeling is they're coming in and undercutting us. We can't get a good wage because capitalism, the great replacement theory, part of it's a racist theory of Jews in one form of importing Muslims to get rid of white people. But underlying that is capital is using cheap labor from overseas to undercut our wages. We don't have the same stability we had in the 60s. It's been outsourced to Mexico or China, and that's what they feel. So they hate Elon Musk. Elon Musk represents everything, though nativists died in the world, white, I won't use the word redneck, but these country guys whose mining industries have gone, who suddenly can only get part-time job in Walmart. Their father was a carpenter or a miner or a car manufacturer, had a lifetime job. American economy has suffered from outsourcing, and they blame people like the tech bros. And so what I'm saying is, you're right, you have this crisis in capitalism, crisis in information, but I don't think, this is the important thing, that Trump is the solution. He embeds the contradictions and has smoothed them over and made this amazing coalition of Muslims who thought that Kamala Harris was pro-Likud, right-wing Jews who thought she was pro-Hamas, all these weird, I'm asking you now, time to reverse it. Aren't we already seeing that coalition falling apart? And it isn't, though he's going to be much more organised. It's going to be a horrific time. You've got this 100 days. You've got all these Heritage Foundation people. They're trying to change everything. But the basis of that organisation, that ideology, is profoundly fractured and incoherent.
The thing I'm always grappling with is the extent to which notions such as ideology are completely trumped by the tech revolution. It's really interesting because, again, you can look at class and economics-based analysis of Brexit or the state of the UK at the moment or why people voted Trump back in. And I feel instinctively, actually, as a journalist, as someone who's very interested in looking at the forces that shape us individually and societally. And I don't know, I mean, everyone I know owns a smartphone.
Yeah.
I don't think everyone I know reads the news. I don't think everyone I know votes in elections. I don't think everyone I know is interested in current affairs. But everyone owns a smartphone, and everyone has seen the benefits of that connection that has brought. But I think you're right. I don't think it is just a sense of connection. It's changed the way we feel about ourselves. We look at ourselves and the world around us and how we make sense of it. And I guess, in a way, whether the coalition falls apart and whether Musk ends up leaving Trump or Bannon creates problems, or I think you're right. Trump seems to be, and that's why he is a politician, because he has managed to sort of hold this coalition together. Whether he can remains to be seen. But I feel like there's something bigger than any of them going on, because Trump was the president and he was voted out. So it's not that people were endlessly satisfied with him, but he was voted back in. And so I don't know whether it's going to be enough in the years ahead that Trump maybe doesn't do a good job, or the coalition falls apart and it seems chaotic or disruptive, or he doesn't achieve what he's saying in terms of the economy. Because as we know from building the wall, a lot of it is the building of the wall in the mind. And I think what all of these people have cottoned onto, whether it's Trump and Musk and this whole coalition, what they all know is the power of tech. As you said, the power of political campaigning, which they knew 10 years ago in a way that the liberal left, democracy and the politicians and media there didn't. And what they know is if they can keep developing tech and the social media platforms and the prominence they have in our lives, and we're talking not just, as we said, about influencing people via a front page, but getting into your heads. I think what they all realize and what they have in common and which won't change is tech is our means to get inside people's heads. And I think as long as that continues and accelerates, and as long as politics is seen as a form of entertainment and a form of hyper-reality, which everyone knows isn't really reality, but we all go along with it, it's a bit of a charade. I don't know, because I think the very discussion we're having, Peter, is what is truth anymore? Is there any such thing as truth? And so this notion that everyone eventually will realize that Trump doesn't deliver, and therefore all the people who voted for him will feel that he has let them down and we're going to vote him out, or the coalition falls apart and that causes chaos and that feels destabilizing. And my concern is that it's even bigger than Trump and any of these players. But the point is they are a key part of it as well. So it's hard to imagine without them what it would be.
Let's agree the revolution, we're 15 years into this 150-year revolution. And look back at the other models of that. Obviously Gutenberg, the printing press, famously, it's not my line, the great innovation that everybody could read, literacy rising, was 150 years of religious war. The next phase rise of the newspapers in the 19th century. In a way, that was a reaction to huge democratic inequalities in Europe. You had revolutions across Europe in 1848, suppressed, nothing happened, but you also had the Chartist movement here. You had the Guardian coming out of the Peterloo massacre, Manchester Guardian, and you actually had amelioration, the papers helped, but you also had mass demonization. And then television and radio, well, radio powered the fascist revolutions. Film helped Hitler and Leni Riefenstahl, but also produced these amazing documentaries in World War II. And then television. So I was brought up to that revolution of television. I was goggle-eyed. My parents would plonk me in front of the TV from the age of 0. And there were essays about what's happening to the TV generation. They're all going to be crazy. Goggle-eyed kids. So this is the next, there's no doubt, and we have not begun to reckon with that.
Now everyone's Google-eyed.
Google, well, very good, yes. But awareness changes things. So it's so interesting. Musk is such a brilliant demonstration of everything Carol Cadwalder was talking about. Nobody believed it. Now everybody does. And look what happened. So this highly influential platform, very journalist aware. We are, Byline Times is a product of social media. We find each other there, but also in print. So one medium doesn't completely replace the other. But look what he tried to do over the summer. So X was a main vector of the racist riots this summer. Organized, promoted fake memes about the attacker being a Muslim and these riots happened in Southport and other places. What happened to all those people? 1,000 people arrested and sent to prison. Meanwhile, Elon Musk has been pushing, saying, oh, there's two-tier here, no free speech here, actively attacking us, saying civil war is inevitable because we live in a multiracial society, defending clear provocateurs, criminals during the riots. How's his popularity doing in the UK? For this guy, this guy with this whole social media influence, he's despised here. One of the lowest ratings. Well, now, there's no doubt he can push his luck. He can target Keir Starmer. He can target the Labour government, destabilise things. There's obviously people like Farage jumping on the bandwagon, all these patriots, conservatives loving what Musk is doing. Doesn't necessarily wash well with the human population, because two things. One is that, though it's ubiquitous, we don't live in a virtual reality. My phone just went during this interview, but I didn't pick it up. There is a reality outside this mediated reality of social media. And there are competing sources. It's not all Musk, it's not all Zuckerberg. So it is still to be fought for, but this is why I agree. It's no longer, especially on this day when Rupert Murdoch's going to trial for 8 weeks for phone hacking and other crimes. That world has gone.
And Trump is being inaugurated. It seems quite symbolic that those two things are happening at the same time. That world is gone.
But a revolutionary world is a revolutionary world. Lots of things change. And so I agree we've got to be less idealistic about liberal democracies, the media system it is. Now, it's terrible in a way. Like what happens to The Observer. Mainstream media, lack of trust is falling apart. Lack of trust, by the way, I was talking to Pekka Kaliomi, Vatnik Soup, last week. That's the key indicator. That going down is the beginning of autocracy. Now, British press has been the bottom of Europe for like a decade. But our broadcast media, BBC, has had high level of trust. I fear that's being undermined. And there are good reasons. That's also in social media. BBC's also got iPlay, that we have to defend the pluralism within the system. One other thing I'd say to you about all these tech companies which are at the inauguration, most of them didn't exist 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So they might not exist in 20 years. Like Ford still exists, Unilever, Hoover, these classic old companies, manufacturing companies, exist 100 years later. What happened to MySpace? What's going to happen to TikTok? They seem very powerful, but they're also quite evanescent. Look what's happening to X compared to Blue Sky, Mm-hmm. So I do think the power of social media, the power of tech, is it can adapt it very quickly and replicate it at zero cost. Copying software is not the same as having to make a car again. It's zero cost. Zero to hero in a few months, right? Or a few years. But it can go from hero back to zero very quickly, and you can exploit that evanescent temporariness of these tech platforms.
I think what's interesting about Elon Musk not being popular, perhaps with the public in the UK, is a very interesting dynamic, which I think is still relevant. I think you're right that in a way, an old world is shifting. But the remnants of that exist. And so in Britain, we still, and Byline Times makes this case, whenever people say to us, you know, and I sound a bit contradictory as to what I'm saying about social media. People say social media is it. That's it. People don't get their news. The traditional outlets are dying and circulations are going. No one's buying papers. And again, it sounds contradictory what I'm about to say, because social media is very important in all the ways we've discussed. But in Britain, it's not so much about the newspaper circulations, which are decreasing, and all kinds of things are happening. You're talking about the Observer and the Telegraph. But I guess what we're talking about is power, and this fusion of power that we see through the Trump's new administration with Elon Musk, who's a member of the government as well as being a tech media baron. In this country, what Murdoch always did represent, and the remnants which still exist is this fusion that actually existed much more clearly in this country than the US, arguably, which is between political power and the media. And in a way, Elon Musk may be unpopular with the public, but there is a reason why the news agendas across the BBC, all the broadcasters, talk radio, and a lot of the established newspapers all led on Elon Musk, all led on the grooming gangs for weeks, as opposed to NHS targets or any other things about the Labour government. Not that it's not a valid topic, but it was driven by Elon Musk's tweets. And so there's a very interesting dynamic whereby, as we've seen so many times in decades gone, Peter, in this country, there is still a distorting impact of the fact that on the right, political power very much goes hand in hand with journalistic power. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that continues to play out in the UK, given that social media is transforming everything else. But the other thing that's really struck me of late is watching the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, which I have to admit I haven't really done before, but I have done recently because I think it's really interesting to gain some insights. And I watched a 3-hour episode with Mark Zuckerberg, the Meta chief.
You should have a medal
he
for that.
He was on there. He was very casually. It's great setup. You know, he talks for hours. He swears and shares jokes. And he was talking very much about the decision of Facebook to get rid of its third-party fact-checking. And what was really striking about that conversation he had with Rogan was the extent to which both of them were referring to the media as an old thing. They weren't even saying that, oh, the traditional media is shifting and the Washington Post and New York Times, it's all in a state of flux. They were referring to it and talking about it as if it was already in the past. And they were talking about how people don't trust those sources anymore. That's why lots of people are coming to social media. And the very interesting thing about all of this was Rogan, you know, he kind of invites people on, talks to them for hours, and arguably can go deep on issues because they've got plenty of time to do so in a way that a newspaper could never do in a few pages. It's really interesting. And so what their whole thing is, oh, the media, no one trusts that. We are the media now. The media is a different thing. And I'm really fascinated because I think it's obviously connected to what you're saying about people's truths and facts and all these different things. But our industry is completely in a state of flux. So some things change and some things don't. But it does feel like a different time, doesn't it, that we're going into?
So, unlike you, I was never professionally trained as a journalist. But I knew a lot of trained journalists, mother of my kids, first woman editor of Newsnight. So I have a very weird feeling about this industry. So I knew a lot of print journalists and I knew intimately TV journalism. I never wanted to be part of it. Why? Because I thought, especially things like the Bosnian War and things like that, there was a fake objectivity, a fake, we're above it all, we're fake. I remember talking to a very famous political editor of the BBC, a well-known name, and I was talking about the phone hacking trial, and she said, why do you care? There is this remoteness that comes from professionalization of journalism. There is, as Jane Rosen talks, this production of innocence. We're above it all, we're the judges, we're objective. And I think that institutional world, Guardian can be a bit like this, was very off-putting, whether it's liberal or conservative. It was elite, superior, thought it knew the business. It was also very tired with news and actually didn't know it that well because they were just generalists. And so actually my entry into journalism was probably around the Obama campaign. That's political blogging in 2004 to 2008, especially around the primaries. And then I did a lot of fact-checking. All the rows people now experience on X or have it. I was having them 2004 to 8, right? And there's this trajectory of heated, I hate you doxing, I'm going to get you, gangs chasing each other around. It was just like the stuff you saw on Twitter. But then this weird thing would happen that somebody produced some facts and the argument died down, and eventually it would become fact-driven and with a consensus. I mean, people had to be banned. It was all this sort of horrors you saw. And so I think the whole world is now going through that early trolling experience I went to 20 years ago. And out of that comes things like Byline Times. Out of that comes like, yeah, the mainstream can't cope, but there can be a community-based standard. Like the community notes don't work on Twitter, but that's how moderation would work in places like Daily Kos or Motley Moosai set up, which is community moderation. That there was a sense there wasn't a big guy in the sky with a stick or a censorship stamp, but we together would come, no, that's too far. No, this is a good source, right? So talking to Pekka Kalliomi is the way that in Finland, they have great misinformation, has very little penetration, because they teach kids from an early age, for like 6, about checking sources and the deliberate tropes and the games you play or that happen around information. So that software needs to be downloaded to everybody. I don't believe in citizen journalism, but I believe in citizen editors. The gatekeepers have gone. And they're right, those gatekeepers only let some people in. In a way, it's about community empowerment. It is about civic society. Is the way we counter people like Musk is boycotting him, that we work together as individuals and collectives to do our own fact-checking. And that, to me, is a real powerful thing, because a bit like the Chartist movement, when people came together, or the unions, maybe there should be a union of fact-checkers or something like that, that those gatekeepers are always going to let us down. Gatekeepers always get corrupted. They charge you at the door. They let their mates in the VIP lane to take a dislike of your face and push you out. Then the tech doesn't stop us doing that.
Yeah, I think what's interesting and the ultimate genius about tech is that we're all part of it. You, me, everyone. And I think there's a temptation to sometimes, again, in this very black and white framing of us and them, or it's people on the right who behave like this on social media, use this terminology, use this rhetoric, use these tactics and weaponize emotionality. But I think we all need to be alive within ourselves to how we are doing that perhaps in small ways, and we're also part of this system, and because we're participating in it. And I think we all have choices within ourselves as to what we choose to hang on to. But just
can I just pick you up on that? Just on a very practical level, you're very good at doing this, Hardeep, is that the tech relied on us not knowing what it was doing. Subterfuge. It relied on us giving it our data unknowingly. And as soon as you know what's being done to you, the magic is gone. Your spell is dropped. And so what I used to do on Facebook, I had a legal case against Facebook because they hacked my data on the Cambridge Analytica app, This Is Your Digital Life. So I didn't use it for ages. And now I'm very careful what I give it. I'm slightly tempted to screw up the algorithm by liking boy bands or something like that. You can screw up the algorithm by doing strange behavior, but also limiting what you show them. And you're very good. You only come on Twitter or X or Blue Sky at key moments. It's quite an ordered, measured thing. You have an article behind it that you realize this is a public space. And they've got you. You're under surveillance. It's surveillance tech, basically.
But also it's a performative space.
Yeah.
And I guess it's about being really honest about that. So I'm very aware that I am entering with good intentions and to learn and to understand and to build community, a space that is performative, which will necessarily have an impact and influence on how I am behaving online. Just like the ability suddenly of a smartphone camera to have the front-facing camera suddenly changes, you know, when we're taking a selfie, not that I often do, obviously that changes our consciousness in terms of how we're appearing. Putting filters on our faces. It's like being aware of what is behind this, like we are the product, and also being aware of what is this new space and how we can be impacted by it too. You know, I probably use more definitive terminology on Twitter or Blue Sky than I would talking to somebody in real life. I think there's this notion of how we have to behave that we have to question. But lastly, because it would be remiss on this inauguration day not to discuss what I think is a crucial factor in the moment we've got to, is Vladimir Putin and how he probably feels about Donald Trump returning to the White House. It doesn't receive huge amounts of media coverage, but it's been really striking since the US presidential election that there have been a number of very public and overt statements by people in the Putin regime about that election. Do you just want to give us some examples or some...
so he now owes us. I think it was one of the Deputy Foreign Minister said that. We expect to pay. All the Duma deputies celebrated his election, as they did in 2016, he's our man.
And sort of saying, making it clear.
We expect a deal, something in return.
I mean, that's always denied, isn't it, by Putin? Well, we've had nothing to do with it, but...
Well, yes, but denied and not denied. I mean, Serena...
So why would they be doing, just on this point, why would they be making these announcements, but then denying what's going on there?
KGB craft, you always give mixed signals. You never give a purchase of truth the opponent could leverage against you. You always dive and duck. It's esteemed. He's often threatening Donald Trump's life. That's what Zarina Zabriskie has got. So the little hints, you don't want another assassination attempt. Oh, yeah, Putin's always got that. And he's making these jokes with these physical threats underneath. This is the nature, by the way, of the Putin regime. For all this talk about open speech, there is no free speech in Russia. If you tweet anything, even say, I'm not talking about anything, you get arrested, a sign with nothing on it. You get arrested and put in prison because it seemed to be a protest against a special military operation. So we have this paradox, don't we? And I do think this is relevant to Musk. We have this paradox of Musk is quite close to speaking to Putin throughout last year. He's always pushing Kremlin talking points about how there should be a settlement. He's always downplaying
a settlement
the algorithm
with Ukraine.
With Ukraine, downplaying, cheating the algorithm so that Ukraine accounts get suppressed, retweeting known tenant media, paid for Russian information operations. So it's a complete different world. The world of tech bros and the world of Vladimir Putin, though of course they're not. Putin is a big developer of online propaganda. That I've written in this month's Byline Times about the many connections and how Cambridge Analytica is very much a Russian operation as well as Cambridge Analytica.
Yeah,
and that's
they appear to be in the distance to the east, but actually Russia and the Putin regime pioneers in information warfare, in the notion that politics and democracy can be destabilized by using information against civilian populations. This notion has always been very well understood by the Russians. And actually, yes, we've had Silicon Valley and the tech Broligarchy developing in America alongside populism of Trump, but Putin foresaw that this direction is for the taking.
But so that's what the podcast was slightly referred to on our front page. So again, the Westminster Spy Ring, I talk about...
It's your podcast with Carol Cadwalder.
And I invited 2013 to the Russian embassy's digital barbecue. And boy, did they barbecue the whole of Europe digitally in the 12 years since. Read about it more in the paper, and there's a long story now of Prigozhin, of Western allies to Russian information operations, hybrid warfare, both learning from each other, supporting each other, and there's an alliance there. And that's really interesting. But I'll say one thing just occurred to me, because I want to say this about Musk, is what looks stable is deeply unstable. Not just the alliance, the internal organizations themselves. So what we love, don't we? One of the best hit TV series in the last few years is Succession. Because you have that Murdoch, apparently this sort of hegemon, this monolith of Murdoch. He knows what he's doing. He terrifies politicians. But within that, my first book I ever wrote when I came a journalist about this was Fall of the House of Murdoch, was the tensions within the family. Absolutely true. There's court cases going on about the succession. So these apparently clear-cut pyramids are febrile and fractured in themselves. You see that in the Murdoch family. And so two things. Elon Musk, the thing about him is, and we all feel it, we can all see it, he's completely unstable. You say he trolls the UK, yeah, but one moment it's that, what could be next? It's not a policy, it's not driven through. He's working with people like Cummings, allegedly, and Farage, trying to destabilize. But there's no policy there. There's no actual platform. It's a series of thought bubbles and anger and WhatsApp groups, let's do that and the other. And I think Putin's like that, right? So the thing to look out for this year is this is a desperate last gamble to get a deal with Trump, whatever deal, I don't know, ceasefire, patrolled. The Russian economy is screwed. It's running on vapors. It's quite close to collapse, I think, within the next year, or major thing happen. Putin staked everything on this. Relatively, Ukraine is stable. It's got all the support from Europe. energy system targeted, functional. Obviously, you had 10 million refugees. It's being bombed daily. It's not in a good state. But it's actually a more stable state, I'd say, than Russia. So whatever deal Putin thinks he's cooked up with Musk and Trump, all of that could collapse just by reality. Because you know what, Hardeep? What will collapse Putin is not a tweet or a paid-for RT account. It's all the rail bearings that are going on their trains. Russia runs on trains, and its train system is beginning to collapse. It runs on oil. Its oil refinery is being hit. The reality has a way of seeping even through your smartphone.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Whether there is an ultimate reality that trumps a virtual reality. Certainly, we live in interesting times, don't we? Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for everybody. We hope we've broken down some of the many factors that have led us to this point. Donald Trump begins his second term in the White House, and Byline Times will be here every step of the way to try to make sense of it all.
Meanwhile, can I just add this? If you want to find out more about Putin's connection to Musk and Trump and the long story of Russian hybrid warfare against the West, to read our fresh new February edition of Byline Times out in the shops this week.